Okay, so picking back up where we left off, let's go back here. Okay, so next I want to talk about the Jews. So, or also known as the Hebrews. So, if we're looking at this part of the world, like I said, the more coastal area here is known as the Levant. And this is a more desert type area where the ancient sort of tribal, originally nomadic pastoralist people of the Jews or Hebrews that came about. And their culture was pretty different from any of the other ones we've looked at so far. So far, just been looking at polytheistic cultures that have lots of gods, whereas the Jews believed in monotheism. And in fact, that's what they're known for historically. There's an idea that God is kind of abstract in a way, that God can't be depicted visually and shouldn't be depicted visually. And that is one way that the Jews set themselves apart. God is somehow outside of the world. It would be wrong to depict him as a bowl or as a tree or as a statue. So that's a cultural clash waiting to happen with other cultures. And there's a very important idea in the Hebrew tradition that God made a contract of sorts with the Hebrew people, which is known as a covenant. That if the people do things for God, God will do things for the people. So the people need to worship God in the right way, and God will protect and look after the Hebrew people and take care of them. They are the chosen people. And interestingly, God's name isn't even entirely pronounceable because in the Hebrew language, it's made all out of breath sounds. So you can't really even get it. You can sort of transliterate it as Jehovah or Yahweh, but those aren't quite right. Those names are always translated as Lord or God. And so again, this emphasizes, God doesn't have a face. He doesn't have you can't even pronounce his name necessarily, and there's only one of him. This is a God that's very different from any other cultures that we see. And the Jews are going to have a big influence. And so they're going to be pretty significant. And they have this idea that is basically a God who is somehow beyond the world. This is a word, transcendent, beyond the world in some way, and the creator of the universe, but not necessarily in the universe. So the Jews, they are going to start coming into contact with these other cultures and sometimes clashing with them. Now we're looking at a little bit more of a timeline. And now it looks a little complicated, but don't worry about it too much. Down on the bottom here, we just have different events in the history of the Jews. So one of them is the founder, the patriarch, Abraham, who first made a covenant with God and sort of established this relationship for the Jewish people. We would predict that this, if it took place, probably took place around the year 2000 BC. So this is during the time of Hammurabi and Babylon. A little bit before Hammurabi, probably, Hammurabi himself, but during his sort of dynasty. And I find it very interesting that Abraham was born in Ur, one of the really significant Mesopotamian Sumerian city-states, because they stay important even after they're taken over. So that's pretty cool, is that it goes that far back. Then we have the story of the Jews in Egypt. If they entered Egypt, which is something that historians debate if that was a real thing, if they were slaves in Egypt, it probably started around sometime around 1700 and ended sometime around 1250 with Moses, who is, again, a figure who may or may not be real, but that's the debated question. Around the year 1000, the holy books that were previously oral were written down, so things like the Torah. And then we are moving into the time period of a new group of people known as the Assyrians. And when the Assyrians take over, the Jews tend to see it as a punishment. They have somehow lost the way, lost their contract with God. And the reason for this is that the Assyrians are particularly brutal. So I'm going to skip around here. But the Assyrians, the Assyrians are vicious and terrifying. They start off in this part of the world, and they quickly expand out and take over this whole region here. until they've even taken over Egypt, which we're going to look at next time, and some parts over here. So they're pretty big, pretty significant, and pretty bloodthirsty. If you go to the palace of Nimrud, which was one of the capital cities of the Assyrians, you may run into these types of statues. And so, first off, Ashur-nasir-pal, the king at that time, he's got the Lamassu watching you as you make your way into his palace. So he's already got these symbols of divinity and power there to intimidate you. And this is a tall thing, you know, it's quite a few meters tall. And they are guarding the gate as they do to the temple of the gods. That's kind of interesting. Okay. Then you've got the palace at Nimrud. You've got these scenes of war and battle. And so very frequently the Syrian kings are shown like trampling lions and bulls in their chariots, hunting them with bows and arrows, and just showing that they could destroy them. They could take them in this very sort of powerful, badass, showing off type of way. The king fighting these wild creatures is a symbol of his power, because these creatures themselves are symbols of power. And in these images, they would also show scenes of battle. So here's Ashur-nasir-pal laying siege to a city. And when there was a city that didn't immediately surrender to someone like Ashur-nasir-pal, the Assyrians would just slaughter everybody inside brutally and make an example of them. That was how they intimidated people, and that was a big part of how they expanded their army. They were not above torture and things like that. But they also had very good military techniques. Here we have kind of a tower on wheels, which is pretty cool, and a battering ram to go up against the walls and to try and get archers to fire back at the other archers here and to batter the walls of a city. Now, the thing to remember is that you would be walking in the opposite direction here. You would be walking along from right to left. So you would see all these guys facing you, all these enemy armies, all these images of the king charging right at you. That would definitely be something that would intimidate you and would show, you know, that this king was not going to mess around. And if you're going to see the king, you have a pretty good idea of what to expect. So yeah, pretty brutal. And so the way to remember the Assyrians versus the Akkadians, I think it's pretty easy to mix up. The thing that always works for me is to remember that the Assyrians are assholes, and that their name is a little bit more like the word asshole than the Akkadians, who are, you know, pretty cool by comparison. So when you finally get into the throne room of Ashur-nasir-pal, again, you've got him seated on the throne, and around him is an image of a tree of life, which was sacred to Assyrian religion, this sort of tree that was associated with the power of life and with the gods. And what he appears to be drinking here is the nectar of immortality. The symbols seem to suggest immortality, seem to suggest gods. And here's the clincher, is that to get finally into his chamber, you have to go in a 90-degree turn. So where have we seen that before? We saw that in the ziggurat. So that's what you do when you're on the way to the temple of a god. And again, the Lamassu were guardians outside the temple of the gods. So what Ashur-nasir-pal and the Assyrian leaders seem to be saying here is, I'm a god, bow down and worship me. Now, it's a little bit ambiguous. For one thing, he doesn't have horns on his hat, but it's very plausible that he's saying he's a god when he's putting so many symbols. At the very least, he's blurring the lines here between human and god and showing that he is a very terrifying figure on earth. And so these people, these brutal sort of conquerors, come and they take over the Jews, and the prophets, and you can still read this in the Jewish holy books and in the Bible, the prophets say that Jerusalem has lost its way. The Jewish people have lost their way. And this is a punishment from God. So jumping back a little bit, I said that the Jewish people started off as nomads, but eventually they settled down. And their sort of old nomadic stories that they told orally were written down during these time periods after they had settled down and started living in cities. And they built capitals at places like Jerusalem and the Kingdom of Israel. And so in the city of Jerusalem, they had the Temple of Solomon, which was the center of worship for the Jewish people, bringing them all together, blessed by God, as this place where the Jewish people had the center of their culture, and it could all come together. So this was a pretty significant city, a pretty significant part of their culture. And we have some depictions of it in later art, as later Jews in the Roman Empire tried to depict the original temple. Now, I say original temple because that temple gets burned down, not by the Assyrians. And we're going to meet in a second here a people who the Jews dislike even more than the Assyrians because they burned down their temple. So this is not the old Babylonians, not the Assyrians, but the new Babylonians. So Babylon takes over again. So we tend to call the first time Babylon takes over as Old Babylon, and we tend to call the second Neo-Babylon, the new Babylonians, Neo meaning new. But it's still the same city, and they have a lot of cultural things in common. Okay, so the Neo-Babylonians take over the Jews, and in 586 BC, they burn down the temple. And what's worse is that they make the Jewish people exiles. They remove them from their homeland and say, you have to live in Babylon now. Now, there's a lot of debate over this. Some think that it might have been that there were a series of rebellions, and it was more like the Jews were kind of being captured as prisoners. But the end result is that they lost their temple and they lived in a foreign country. And this lasted for a period of about 30 years. And that's why Babylon really comes across as the villains a lot of the time in the Bible, as the bad guys, because the Jews did not like these guys at all. And there's a lot in the Bible and in the Jewish holy books, which predate the Bible, about the sort of Babylonian exile or Babylonian captivity. One of the guys who come up is Nebuchadnezzar, who appears to be one of the more significant kings of Neo-Babylon. One of the things he contributed was this beautiful, gorgeous gate outside the city that the holy processions of Babylonian religion, which is pretty similar to Sumerian religion in a lot of ways, that he would, lead this parade through this glorious gate, which is painted with gold and lapis lazuli. The other thing that he had in Babylon was a spectacular ziggurat, a really tall, beautiful, imposing one that just loomed over the whole rest of the city. And some people think that this ziggurat, which towered over the landscape, was the inspiration for the Tower of Babel. This story where humans tried to defy God, and so God cast down their tower that was trying to climb up to the heavens and reach him, and scrambled the languages and created all the different languages so they couldn't understand each other. That may be influenced by this ziggurat. Babylon being pretty similar words. And in later parts of the Bible too, Babylon is seen as this symbol of decadence and too much sexuality and too much indulgence and things like that. But just looking at this Ishtar Gate, we can see it's actually been moved to a museum in Berlin in Germany. And some pieces of it have had to been put back together. But you see all these animals on it and that great gold and lapis lazuli aesthetic. Some of the animals, we don't know what they are. They might be mythical creatures. Some of them are things like deer and horses and lions. So it's an interesting glimpse, and it's really spectacular to see in person if you ever get the chance. But not something that the Jews necessarily liked very much. So the Jews went through their captivity in Babylon when the Babylonians burned down their temple. But it only lasted for about 30 years. When another group of people took over, the Jews were allowed to rebuild their temple and reestablish themselves and go back to their homeland. And so that was obviously going to be regarded as a pretty great move. And that sort of marks a pretty big period in Jewish history: the creation of the temple, the destruction of the temple, and then the new temple, which lasts up until the Romans come along and cause their own kind of trouble. Yeah, so this period of being exiles in Babylon had a big influence on the Jews and a big influence on the way Babylon has traditionally been depicted. Um, but it's worth thinking about that we have a sort of biased perspective there. But uh, next time, or not next time, but in the future, we're going to go into more detail with the people who took over after that, who are the Persians. But if you can guess how the Jews might have felt about the Persians who freed them of Babylonian tyranny and let them go home again and let them rebuild their temple again, you can imagine that they probably liked the Persians an awful lot. And yes, they totally did. In fact, at one point they thought that the king of the Persians might be the Messiah. So those are kind of the bookends of Jewish history. And along the way, we're introducing you to the major sort of different civilizations and some things to know about them over the course of their history. So just to recap, we had the Sumerians back starting at the very beginning around 3500. We had the Akkadians take over, including Naram Sin, who thought he was a god. Then we have Old Babylon, where we have Hammurabi. Then we have the sort of gradually growing power of the Assyrians. Nobody really is super powerful at this time period. And then finally, the Assyrians managed to take over completely, cause a lot of destruction, and intimidate their enemies in the most brutal way. And then finally, after that, we have Neo-Babylon, which burns down the Jewish temple and so gets a pretty bad rap. But it's probably pretty similar to Old Babylon and is our source for a lot of the mythology of this region. And then after that, the Persians are going to come in, and we'll talk about the Persians a lot more when we get to the Persians fighting the Greeks. Okay, so thanks for bearing with me through all this stuff here. I know that's a lot of different civilizations, but hopefully, we hit the high points of what makes them different, what makes them interesting. I will see you guys in the discussion question today, which is basically a discussion question of should we talk about all of these as part of the same Mesopotamian culture? Do we think they all have enough in common that they are all part of one culture? Or should we talk about them individually and say that the idea of Mesopotamians isn't a useful word? What do you guys think? That's our question for today. So make sure to make a post on that by Tuesday. No, sorry. Yeah, by Tuesday. And and if you can make a reply to someone else, even better. All right, I'll see you guys in the discussion.